All right, time once again for a meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, we start tonight in the traditional way, as we always do when she's here. So I am going to flip it right over to friend of our chapter from the Boston area, Joanne Hulbert, who is here tonight with a poem. Joanne, you're up. Go.
Okay, this is for Bruce Allardice. Now, I will confess that I did hear his presentation just a few days ago, and it must be really good because I'm here again and I'm going to hear it again. So that's really something. But the other thing that I want to do in particular, in regard to a dedication to him and what he has done with his 1870s White Sox, anyway, comes from the inspiration on a recent publication by SABR. And the name of the book, if you haven't already heard about it, it is Here Comes the Pizza. Now, you have to get the book to find out what that has to do with everything. But what this is a compilation of poetic writings that were taken from radio announcers who are watching the game and making comments, and writers have taken these comments like almost play by play and turn them into poems. And so I looked to see if I could find maybe a Chicago poem in 1870. That didn't work out, but I did find this, and this works just as well. And it is in the same spirit of poetry as this recent book. Now, they didn't have radios or radio announcers back in 1870. Of course, they were only the newspapers. But what they have here on a play-by-play, or at least the report of a game, works out perfectly in the same way that the radio announcing poems, the freelance poems that they were doing, it works out the same. This is from an article from September of 1870. And the title of the article and of this poem is The Reds Feel Badly. How the defeat of the Reds by the Chicago club has annoyed the Chicago people. The following extract from the Cincinnati Times will show. It was all the umpire's fault, of course. The truth of the matter is that the Red Stockings are an overrated club, and further experience will show them to be such. I'm going to drop down here. We're going to go down to the part about that umpire. It would be sort of like verse number 7. Perhaps never before was such a crowd affected in such a manner by such an umpire. He was hooted at and yelled at, was told to get out on a fly, but with a nonchalance worthy of any man, by the name of Mulligan or Milliken, or whatever name he may have had, he stood near the home plate, a monument of determination. But I will not go on because I could. But I will send this to you, Bruce, so that you can get the full measure and see just how poetic the writing is, of course, that we know about in the 19th century. And it does lend itself to be a classic poem, as this was. So there you go. Have it.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Joanne. I appreciate that. So,
doesn't seem like I would like it.
Uh-oh. Yep. Roger showing off the Cincinnati Reds garb here. Go ahead and say something, Roger, so we can get on camera. Love it.
That's what we got to do.
I love it. All right. For those of us in the area, I don't want you to forget this, but Friday, May 30th, the Nashua Silver Knights will take on the Vermont Lake Monsters in Futures League action at, get this, 6:03 p.m. And we're going to be there. The Silver Knights have graciously agreed to provide us with a table to show the community what SABR is all about, our connection to Nashua and Holman Stadium, and to a place to hold a book swap and a membership drive. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have stuff for the kiddos to learn about baseball and the impact Clyde made on the sport. And here in New Hampshire. It's going to be an all-inclusive evening. If you would like to come out and help us, please do so. Email me today at bruce@brucemclurenh.com. We're looking for an even bigger turnout than we already have to show the community what SABR is all about. All right, on to our feature presentation. Baseball already had a strong and storied foothold in Chicago when, in late 1869, the elite Chicago business community, jealous that Cincinnati, the Windy City's biggest rival in the Midwest, had formed their seemingly unbeatable Reds, got together to form a rival baseball club of professionals, vanquish the Reds, and take the unofficial title of national champions. The businessmen subscribed to a fund of $18,000 to hire the best players away from other, mostly Eastern professional and semi-professional clubs. This new Chicago team, which one newspaper nicknamed the White Stockings, got off to a rocky start. They were deemed a failure, a civic embarrassment. They were mocked as the $18,000 Lemons, but they eventually gelled as a team and went on to defeat the hated Reds and claim the national championship, but not without controversy, as other clubs made their own claims to be national champion. A recently retired professor of history at South Suburban College, Bruce Allardice, is an avid sports historian. He currently heads up the Civil War baseball subcommittee for SABR and is a member of SABR's Biography committee, specializing in researching the lives of 19th century ballplayers. His article on the rise of baseball in the South received an award from the Society for American Baseball Research for Best Baseball History Article of 2012. And he is here tonight to give his presentation entitled Chicago's First Champions, the White Stockings of 1870. Bruce Allardice, welcome to Northern New England. How are you?
Thank you, Bruce, for your warm introduction. It's nice being a recently retired person, by the way. I don't have to worry about getting fired by anybody or let go.
Look, I can punt you right now. I'll let it slide. You, my friend, are on. I am sharing your presentation right now, and it is all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me tonight. Perhaps I should add that I'm also the head of the Origins of Baseball Committee for SABR and the editor of the Origins of Baseball Protoball newsletter, and I run the Protoball website. So basically anything before 1871 in baseball, I'm pretty much involved in it. So it's very appropriate that I'm going to be talking about an 1870 team tonight. This is my talk at the Fred conference on which this was based. I actually put this together and then shrunk it down for the Fred conference because, as you probably know, we only have 25 minutes tops to give that presentation. So hopefully this will be a somewhat different presentation than what Joanne heard at the Fred conference. And yes, Joanne, I am going to mention that umpire. Start out with, at the Fred conference, I thought it was appropriate that I, who am the world's biggest White Sox fan, in fact, I'm writing a history of the Chicago White Sox in the 1920s. It was appropriate that I was the last speaker because finishing last seems to be what Chicago does best, especially in baseball. But today I'm going to be talking about a Chicago team that did not finish last, the 1870 Chicago White Stockings. Today I hope to explore how professional baseball arrived in Chicago. And in this presentation, I'm going to trace the establishment of the White Stockings, reveal how the city of Chicago caused Chicago to adopt professional baseball, show how Chicago rated the East Coast teams for talent, and how Chicago dubiously achieved its first baseball championship. Next slide. This is the Chicago Tribune report of the first match game ever played in Chicago. This is July 8th, 1858, Chicago Tribune, of a game the day before. It was a 2-inning game, 11 players aside. Arguably more scored like cricket than like New York rules baseball. And Chicago was playing the Downers Grove Plowboys, which was a farm team from the sticks, so to speak. And Chicago lost this game 71-11. Wow. No, the Chicago team was not the current Chicago White Sox. Next slide. But by 1870, baseball had been tremendously established in Chicago. I've counted detailed about 300 different baseball teams that were formed in Chicago before 1871. And as you can see, this is sort of a breakdown by year. And as you can see, it starts a little slowly. When the Civil War happens, it slows it down to practically nothing. And then baseball just explodes after the Civil War is over. We see a lot of company-sponsored teams, like the Potter Palmers of Potter Palmer, the great merchant prince, who was also the builder of the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago. We had Marshall Field's, several teams sponsored by Marshall Field's, the big department store in Chicago that lasted for 150 years. And the Chicago Excelsiors were considered Chicago's premier team. Not necessarily the best team on the field, but they were the ones that were the first really well-established team, especially in the early days. Their personnel was doctors and lawyers and young clerks, very well-connected socially and everything. And the Chicago Excelsiors are actually going to be sort of the forerunner of the Chicago White Stockings that I'm going to be talking about, because the Excelsiors disbanded in 1869, essentially, but a lot of the people who ran the Excelsiors are going to be the sponsors of this new baseball team, this new professional baseball team that we have in Chicago. Next slide. Well, this is a picture of the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings, and they were the first openly professional team. And when I say openly professional, I refer to the fact that many so-called amateur teams during the period had in fact hired great players away from the other clubs with jobs and with other financial and other inducements. You can almost call them semi-pro teams, I guess, to be more accurate. College football today, as you know, they're paying the players now. That's sort of the amateur level of the top Eastern teams at this time. They weren't really amateur, but they pretended to be non-professional. Now, the Red Stockings broke with this tradition. They were openly professional. The Red Stockings hired top players from across the nation and quickly proved that if your team wants to compete on the highest level, part-time amateur players can't compete with full-time professional players. The Cincinnati Reds set a record of 81 straight victories between 1869 and the middle of 1870. They toured the nation. They even went to the West Coast of California and beat the teams there. And most of their games were against local amateur teams or semi-pro teams, and they were winning by lopsided scores. 65-6 against the San Francisco team. About 85-3 against an Omaha, Nebraska team. Thus, in my mind, 1870 is a transition year in baseball. As the top amateur teams, and the idea that this is an amateur sport, they're being replaced by professional teams, openly professional teams, both in victory and in newspaper attention. The professional teams are dominating the headlines of the local newspapers, not the local amateur teams anymore. Next slide. Well, why did Chicago hate Cincinnati? Well, because of pork, of all things. Both Chicago and Cincinnati vied for the title of Porkopolis, the pork capital producing, the pork producing capital of the nation. Now, why? God only knows, but they were. By the 1860s, the Chicago stockyards, which had really been started during the Civil War, were slaughtering so many pigs each year that if they were laid end to end, the pigs would stretch from Chicago to Florida. And Chicago saw Cincinnati as its main rival. The two were, in fact, roughly similar population. And neither was the biggest city in the Midwest. St. Louis was by a large margin. Now, since Chicago's idea that it's the second city, its rivalry with New York City, that comes much later. In 1870, Chicagoans may have deferred to New York City for baseball primacy, but they were damned if they're going to be deferring to Cincinnati, their Midwestern rival. Next slide. Yeah, they hate Cincinnati too. Chicago's business elite decides to organize their own professional team to compete with the Reds. Now pictured is Potter Palmer, perhaps Chicago's premier merchant, and Civil War hero General Phil Sheridan, who was the commander of the Midwestern Department of the United States Army at the time. Fort Sheridan, which is north of Chicago, is of course named for General Sheridan. A baseball fanatic, Potter Palmer sponsored his own amateur baseball team, the Potter Palmers, which played statewide. Now, he sent out word to local businessmen that there'd be a meeting that was held at the Briggs House Hotel in Chicago on October 1st to discuss the formation of a professional baseball team. Some 50 of Chicago's elite businessmen attended. Mr. S.W. Tanner was called to order to run the meeting, and he announced the intention of the meeting was to form a professional baseball club. Fred Irby, who had been elected secretary, said that a number of gentlemen had mentioned they wanted in on this plan. A member of the Chicago Board of Trade said that they would back it. And among those in attendance were Potter Palmer, General Phil Sheridan, industrialist and inventor George Pullman, the inventor of the Pullman sleeping car, J.M. Richards, the president of the Chicago Board of Trade, Chicago Tribune city editor Samuel J. Medill, whose brother Joseph owned the Chicago Tribune, railroad executive J.W. Midgley, a former ball player himself from Canada, the editor of the Chicago Times, Francis Wilkley, merchant and future United States Senator Charles B. Farwell, and David Gage, who previously served as city treasurer. Now, as you can see, these were the Chicago business elite. They were self-made men. None of them had inherited wealth. They'd made their money in Chicago. They were very practical businessmen. Most of the meeting was spent discussing whether or not it was financially possible for the city to support a professional baseball club. It would not be until a later date that the team was actually organized. October 12th is the formal organization. Potter Palmer was elected club president. Hotel owner David Gage was elected treasurer. The corresponding secretary for the club became Chicago Tribune sports editor Todd Cowles. While veteran baseball person Tom Foley became the team's first general and business manager. This was a joint stock corporation. They sold shares. 600 shares were offered at $25 a piece, which raised $15,000 right there. And the businessmen were supposed to pay up 60% in advance. Besides these 600 shares, there were 150 honorary members who paid $10 a year each to get a season ticket. In all, about $18,000 was raised. And if you're curious, the $18,000 would be the equivalent of about $450,000 today, which of course then bought you a baseball team, but now wouldn't even get you a backup shortstop for the White Sox. 18,000 may not sound like much, but this was more than the entire Cincinnati Reds payroll, which led newspapers outside of Chicago to deride the Chicago club as the quote-unquote $18,000 nine. By the end of the month, an advertisement was placed in the New York Clipper, sort of the church bulletin of baseball at the time, and it was an advertisement for baseball players to play for the Chicago club. Now, this club was unnamed at the time, but early in 1870, a Chicago Tribune reporter noted the long white stockings the players wore and nicknamed the team the quote-unquote White Stockings. This nickname stuck, and this club is the ancestor of the Chicago Cubs team that we know of today. Next slide. Now, these are just images of some of the executives of this club. Many of them have been associated with the old Chicago Excelsiors. Starting on the top left, there's President David Gage, who owned the Tremont Hotel. Colonel Norman Gassett, who was the city treasurer. Vice President Willard Wentworth, who was a hotel owner and former city treasurer and former president of the Chicago Excelsiors. Then you have William F. Tucker, president of the Stockyard Bank. Recording Secretary William Lowe was the former secretary of the Chicago Excelsiors. Corresponding Secretary Todd Cowles, who was the sports editor of the Chicago Tribune. The trustees, Philip Wadsworth was a clothing store magnate. Samuel John Medill, whose brother owned the Chicago Tribune. Restaurant owner Fred Irby, Don Foley, who we talked about before. Albert Crosby, who owned the Chicago Opera House. And James McVicker, who owned the famed McVicker's Theater, which still stands. As you can see, these are very well-connected businessmen who knew each other in business as well as socially. Next slide. And this is the ad they put in the not only the New York Clipper, but also the Spirit of the Times, another New York-based sporting publication. They placed an ad just like any business would place an ad calling for new employees. But of course, T.Z. Cowles and the Chicago businessmen were not naive enough to think that a mere ad in the newspaper would recruit the flock of top players. So in the winter of 1869, they sent agents to talk turkey to the top players of the New York and Philadelphia clubs. However, the early response dampened the enthusiasm of the Chicago businessmen. The stars of the top teams, the Mutuals of New York, the Atlantics of Brooklyn, the Philadelphia Athletics, players such as Deacon White and Cherokee Fisher, well-known names at the time, they listened to Chicago's pitches, but most turned down the offers. And in fact, by January of 1870, the Chicago Tribune was criticizing the management of the team for the, quote, bungling inefficiency. At that point, only 2 players had been signed. And with a number of the star players had signed with other clubs and thus slipped through Chicago's, quote, procrastinating fingers. The newspaper proclaimed, quote, the thing has fizzled. This is the Chicago Tribune saying this. And remember, the Chicago Tribune was instrumental in forming the team in the first place. Again, the team secretary is the sports editor of the Chicago Tribune and the owner's brother. The New York Clipper, then the Church Bulletin of Baseball, observed that the managers of the Chicago club were finding out that, quote, getting up a ball club on paper is one thing, and getting together 9 players and making them stick quite another, unquote. Worried, the club sent one of their 2 signees, second baseman Jimmy Wood, along with business manager Tom Foley, sent him out east to sign more players. Now, Wood had connections with all the players on the East Coast, and he was very respected, very well connected. He faced an uphill battle, but he succeeded. As he later recalled, when he approached the players, the team's goal of beating the Reds seemed daunting. Most of the players answered me, it can't be done. The Reds are unbeatable, and we aren't going to waste all of next spring and summer practicing for it, unquote. Wood had to pay them advance money out of his own pocket to lure the players to sign. Next slide. This is a picture of Tom Foley, the business manager, who plays an instrumental part in forming the team. Again, he was a shrewd recruiter. He owned a billiard parlor. He was just a very well-known businessman, and the people who formed the executive committee of the team had their own businesses to run full-time, so they left a lot of the detail work to people like Tom Foley. Next slide. This is a picture of the Chicago White Stockings Club in 1870. They are posing in front of one of their two home ballparks. The home ballpark is that they used for when they were playing a team that was thought to be draw a large crowd was Dexter Racetrack, which is on the southwest side. It was about where the Chicago stockyards were. This was an enclosed racetrack and they could charge admission. They played on the infield, sort of like the infield of the Kentucky Derby you saw a couple days ago. For their non-revenue games, they generally played at a place called Ogden State Skating Park, which is just a little bit north of the Chicago River, just off of Michigan Avenue. Now, as with the Cincinnati Reds, the players weren't Chicagoans, but rather import from top East Coast teams. Their names are shown on the bottom there, and while you may not recognize the names of the players, but fans at the time knew that these guys were some of the best players drawn from the New York and East Coast teams. Next slide. Here's another picture of them. Now, recruiter Jimmy Wood had played for second base for the Brooklyn Eckfords, one of these top semi-pro teams. He persuaded his former Eckford teammates, catcher Charlie Hodis, infielder Ed Pinkham, and outfielder Fred Tracy, to join the Sox. From the Philadelphia A's, he poached outfielders Ned Cuthbert and Levi Meyerly. The Unions of Lansingburg, the famed Haymakers, lost to Chicago catchers Bill Craver and Mark King, first baseman Bub McAtee, and Clipper Flynn. As we'll see, Craver is going to leave Chicago in mid-year under a cloud, and he was replaced by Ed Duffy, a former New York Mutual and Brooklyn Eckford. Sub George Curl came from the Maryland Club of Baltimore. Now, this was some of the best talent of the nation. Baseball legend Henry Chadwick called catcher Bill Craver, quote, the great North American catcher, a tremendous hitter. Ned Cuthbert is credited, probably erroneously, with being the first player ever to steal second base. Cuthbert went on to have a long career in the big leagues as player and manager. Levi Meyerly was such a heavy hitter that the next year, 1871, when he was with Philadelphia of the NA National Association, he batted .492 that year, led the league. Baseball Reference, again, a great source for information, says that there had been a Most Valuable Player award in 1871. Meyerly would have won it. In recognition of his organizing efforts, Chicago named Jimmy Wood the team captain. Next slide. I've got to thank Craig Brown and his Threads of the Game for this image of the uniforms in full color. As described by the Chicago Tribune, each ballplayer wore a new uniform, which, quote, consists of a blue cap adorned with a white star in the center, white flannel shirt, trimmed with blue and bearing the letter C on the breast worked in blue. Pants of a bright blue flannel, stockings of pure white British thread, shoes of white goat skin with the customary spikes. The ensemble constituted by far the showiest and handsomest uniform ever started by a baseball club. I think today's clubs could be in that uniform and look very nice in them. But as you can see, the club could just as easily have been nicknamed the Chicago Blue Pants as they were the Chicago White Stockings. Next slide. Now, shortly before the season started, Potter Palmer, who had a lot of other business interests, obviously, resigned as team president and was replaced by hotel owner David Gage. By opening day of the 1870 season, or the unofficial opening day, the roster was filled. The players were outfitted in those handsome uniforms you just saw with their white stockings, again, which caused the newspapers to nickname this team the White Stockings. After an early victory in St. Louis against an amateur team, Chicago Tribune headlined the win, quote, "Another victory for the Chicago White Stockings," and the name stuck. The team opened the season. Remember, there's no set schedule this time. They opened the season by defeating 2 amateur teams in Chicago. Then they traveled south, sort of a spring training thing, to take advantage of the warmer weather down south. It's pretty cold in Chicago in April, by the way. They defeated the Union Club of St. Louis by a score of 47-1. They then went to New Orleans with 4 easy wins against local New Orleans teams. Coming back north, they played a Memphis team called the Bluffs, which is supposed to be the best amateur team in West Tennessee. Chicago won this game 157-1. Now that might be the biggest slaughter I've ever seen in all the baseball games I've ever tried to document. This is May 13th. Allegedly, team business manager Foley was very angry at the Chicago White Stockings because his club had allowed the Southerners to score even 1 run. White Stocking Fred Tracy hit 4 home runs and 2 doubles in the game. The team batted in the last of the 9th. There was no, if you're batting last, you finished out full 9 innings of batting. They scored 23 runs in the 9th inning just to show that they could do it. They came back north to Kankakee, which is an hour south of Chicago. They beat the Kankakee team 111-5. 2 more wins in Chicago rounded out their spring training. They beat teams and amateur teams in the Midwest. Then they went out east for their first long road trip. They continued their unbeaten ways. Through the end of June, they were 30-0. But they'd only played 2 top professional or semi-professional teams, the Forest City of Rockford and the Forest City of Cleveland. Their victims were mostly amateur teams. Well, eventually they visited New York and Philadelphia, and this brought their lofty dreams down to reality. In 5 games against the top Eastern professional clubs, they only won twice. Later in July, they fell even further, losing to the Mutuals of New York, the soon-to-be champions, the Athletics of Philadelphia, the past champions, the well-regarded Unions of Lansingburg, the Haymakers, and even to the amateur Harvard College 9. Perhaps their low point was a July 23rd game in Chicago at Dexter Park, a 9-0 loss to the New York Mutuals that a New York newspaper dubbed, quote, "the worst whipping on record." The team would achieve a dubious distinction that year by being the first professional club ever to be shut out. Incredulous, the Chicago Tribune wondered, quote, "who would have thought such a thing possible?" What sane individual conversant with the general subject would have incurred the risk of an examination before a commission of lunacy by admitting the bare possibility of a shutout? Scores of 0 were so rare at the time, they didn't even have a specific word for that. So the sports writers at this time coined the word Chicagoed for any team that was shut out, replacing the sometimes used term whitewashed. Games with a score of 0 were just incredibly rare at the time. They didn't even have a word for it. Eastern newspapers saw the shutout and the White Stockings' troubles. They began to call the team the $18,000 Lemons. Chicago newspapers joined the outcry, asserting that the club had as much raw talent as Cincinnati, and perhaps more. They noticed that they never played as a unit before, nor worked together in the manner that the Cincinnati Reds had made famous. The, quote, perfection in collective play that the Reds excelled in simply wasn't there. Worse, 1 or 2, quote, terribly turbulent spirits disrupted team harmony. New York newspapers noted the, quote, lack of discipline, especially while batting. Playing for individual show, every batter was trying to make a home run. To the New Yorkers, the club had exposed itself as, quote, humbugs, mountebanks, and sideshow people of no ability, except in the Barnum style of baseballing. The Chicago Republican newspaper called for an overhaul of the team from top to bottom, blaming both players and management. They called for the immediate reorganization of the club. As a result, on August 8th, David Gage was ousted as president and was replaced by Norman T. Gassett, who represented the majority of the shareholders. Next slide. This is the picture of Colonel Norman Gassett, a lawyer who became club president as part of this reorganization. He was a very prominent Chicago lawyer and politician. He was the clerk of the city court at the time. And in fine Chicago political tradition, visiting teams visiting Chicago to play the White Stockings, accused Gassett of cheating them out of the gate receipts from Chicago's games. Next slide. Now, we talked about the turbulent spirits before, and this is the main turbulent spirit, Bill Craver. Henry Chadwick, the early baseball pioneer known as the father of baseball, referred to Craver as, quote, the great American catcher, being safe, sure, and reliable behind the bat, and a tremendous hitter. In the spring of 1870, Craver had left the confines of Troy and the land of the Haymakers and signed a contract with the Chicago White Stockings. The Chicago Tribune hopefully wrote that, quote, Craver is not one of the revolving kind, and there is no doubt of his sticking to the agreement. However, an injury to his hand disabled the catcher for some time. And unable to catch, Craver moved to other positions in the field, including shortstop and the outfield. But by August of that year, tempers were wearing thin. Craver was expelled from the club, by the club, quote, on account of a mixture of personal and financial reasons. Though he was deemed to have no superior in America, perhaps no equal when it came to his prowess as a catcher, the club's hand was forced. A day later, the club released a public statement regarding the grievance, noting that Craver had violated his contract in a number of ways. But his most egregious sin was disregard of rule number 13 of his contract. Quote, gambling of any manner whatever is prohibited at all times, and no player of the club shall change the games in which he plays or induce others to try to do so. The catcher had, quote, violated the confidence of the public in said 9 by, quote, having received money as inducement for aiding in winning games. Craver was also accused of not acting like a gentleman. Yeah, this is 1870. You were expected to act like a gentleman. Of not playing when ordered to, and of seeking, quote, to create strife and confusion in the 9, among other things. The club moved that Craver be expelled from baseball completely and his contract be made null and void. To carry matter further, the club refused to play any club that employed Craver. But the war between the White Stockings and Craver was just beginning. The following day, August 22nd, Craver fired back heatedly with a letter to the Tribune, defending himself against the allegations. It's an interesting defense he makes. He first addressed the accusation that he did not play when ordered to do so. He admitted it, but he said he was sick at the time and unable to play. He informed Mr. Tom Foley, who told him he would take no hour's notice and that Craver was to put on his clothes and play no matter what. But Craver, looking to his health and looking supposedly to the interests of the team, refused to take his position. Further, he denied using bad language on the field of play and smoking. He did admit to drinking liquor on the diamond, but he said the other players on the team drank also. And the team officials brought booze to them in the dugout. With regard to the gambling accusations, Craver took a shot at the author of the Chicago letter, team secretary Fred Irby. First, he acknowledged that he gambled, he had broken Rule 13. But he said when he bet, he actually bet with Fred Irby. The Chicago official was throwing him off the team for gambling. Craver then claimed the only money he received from said game was not the bet, but $10 sent to every player by the owner, Norman Gassett, as a reward for having beaten the Rockford club. He further stated that in 3 or 4 instances during his Eastern trip, Mr. Phelps, then manager of the club, gave me $10 when the Chicago 9 won. Craver said this was the only inducement he ever received for winning games, that he received no inducement from his bets. Craver was not finished, and his concluding barbs were very sharp and pointed. Quote, "It strikes me that the managers of the Chicago 9 would talk less about conduct becoming gentlemen and put in a little more practice in that direction, a vast improvement will have been made." He said the accusations were a tissue of falsehood and a great array of glittering generalities made to cover a chasm in which there is substantially nothing but sound. A grand crater of jealousy and rivalry between certain parties who have always rankled and will always rankle for a position to which they are not entitled either by tact or intelligence. Obviously, after this letter, Craver burned his bridges with Chicago. I might also note that newspapers were not the only ones at that time to be able to write something in very flowery language. Obviously, Craver could write in flowery language also. But what happened next? Marshall King took Craver's place as catcher. Business manager Foley lured shortstop Ed Duffy away from the Brooklyn Efforts to join the team. 4 players who'd been sick or injured during the summer eventually recovered. The team also switched the baseball they used for the games. According to Henry Chadwick, I quoted before, the pioneer sports writer and Hall of Famer, in the club's early games, they racked up huge scores using a lively, rubberized, quote-unquote, rocket baseball. Now, in those days, clubs could choose what baseball they chose to play with, so long as the baseballs met the size and weight restrictions. Now, this ball could be hit very far, but also cause bruised and battered fingers to those trying to field the hot shots off the bat. Now, remember, there were no gloves used at the time. When the White Stockings visited New York, according to Chadwick pointed out to Captain Wood, an old friend, that the lively ball they were using ruined their players' hands and caused them to make discreditable errors. According to Chadwick, the ball they were using destroyed the really excellent fielding skill the White Stockings possessed. So when the White Stockings returned from their Eastern trip, they started using a quote-unquote dead ball. The change in balls, players, and management seemed to get all the pieces in place for the team to finally play up to its ability. Next slide. And they caught fire. The reformed team won 18 of its next 19 games, losing only to the forest city of Rockford. Particularly pleasing was a 22-11 drubbing of the same New York Mutual Club that had shut them out earlier in the season. And at this time, the New York Mutual Club, for reasons I'll explain in a little bit, were these claiming to be the champion club of the nation. They also had a very pleasing 10-6 victory over the Cincinnati Red Stockings in Cincinnati. And the Chicago newspapers, being the frontrunners that they are, the same newspapers that derided the club earlier are now praising them for their wonderful play and good moral character. The Cincinnati game had particular significance because in the 1860s, the baseball title of champion only changed hands when a challenging team defeated the champions, existing champions, in a head-to-head home-and-home series, 2 out of 3. Sort of like how a boxer becomes champion by defeating the existing champion. With this victory in Cincinnati, the White Sox were halfway to their goal of dethroning and humbling Cincinnati, their hated rival. And secondarily, they were on track to become national champions, which is not really what the team was formed for in the first place. Their only loss during this time was to the Forest City of Rockford, whom they defeated earlier that year. Now, this is a legitimate loss that the Chicago newspapers admitted that Forest City, Rockford outplayed them. And they blamed, oh, not yet. They blamed the loss in part on the fact that the manager put guys in different positions than what they were used to. Now, there one game that was disputed during this time was a narrow victory in Fort Wayne against the Kekiunga of Fort Wayne, an amateur club. The rain threatened, and the clubs, according to the Kekiunga team, were said to have agreed to a 5-inning contest. But at the end of the 5th inning, with Fort Wayne ahead 13-12, Chicago requested to play another inning, which Fort Wayne agreed to. Then Chicago scored 4 runs amidst a drizzle. The game had to be called because of a bad field, and Chicago claimed a 16-13 victory. The New York Clipper, sort of a New York based bias here, said that the sharp practice of the Chicago club should be a warning of other teams not to play Chicago. However, both the Chicago Tribune and the Fort Wayne newspaper agreed that no such 5-inning agreement had been made, and that the game was legitimately called by the umpire after 6 innings on account of rain. Next slide. The next slide. Yes, the New York Mutuals were now the champions. They had beaten the Brooklyn Atlantics, and I'll get into who the champion is a little bit later, on September 15th. This was their second victory against the Brooklyn Atlantics, and now they claim to be the champion baseball team of the nation. Next slide. Well, I talked about the Chicago team beating Cincinnati in Cincinnati 10-6. Cincinnati objected to the legitimacy of the game, saying that their star shortstop, George Wright, was injured for the game and couldn't play. They also objected to umpire bias, which again, Joanne Hobart mentioned earlier. But again, looking at the game reports, it appears that the umpire wasn't biased. He was simply incompetent, but he was incompetent fairly for both teams. So neither team really had a legitimate chance to object to him. And again, both teams had agreed to the umpire. Well, Chicago plays Cincinnati in Chicago at Dexter Park. And an incredible, and for the time incredible, 18,000 fans attended, including 500 ladies. Again, this is specifically mentioned by the newspaper. And you can see how the two cities' reaction was to the game. The Chicago Tribune headline said, quote, "White above red. The redoubtable Red Stockings defeated by Chicago's $18,000 nine." When the Garden City, that was Chicago's nickname at the time, it wasn't the Windy City until 1893. When the Garden City set out to do a thing, she does it. It took money to accomplish the business, but it is done. But I like what the Cincinnati Gazette wrote. The umpire was against us. The weather was against us. The crowd was against us. The heavens were against us. The ground was against us. The pestilential air of the Chicago River was against us. The Chicago Nine were against us. And last but not least, the score was against us. Next slide. Well, by the end of October, Chicago was in position not just to claim superiority over Cincinnati, but to challenge for the championship pennant. And yes, there was a pennant in those days, an actual physical pennant. The Mutuals had claimed the championship back in September when they defeated the Brooklyn Atlantics for the second time, the Brooklyn Atlantics having been the holdover champions from the year before. Now, the White Stockings had beaten the Mutuals in New York after they became championships. So It was believed, according to baseball practice at the time, that the White Stockings could beat the Mutuals in a second match while the Mutuals were champions. Then they could lay claim to the pennant. However, the November 1st match between the two clubs ended in controversy. At the end of 8 innings, Chicago led 7-5. However, in the top of the ninth, New York scored 8 runs to go ahead 13-7. In the bottom of the ninth inning, Chicago mounted a comeback, aided by some controversial umpiring. With 1 out and Chicago batting, with the Mutuals still leading by a score of 13-12, the Mutuals left the field in protest over what they asserted was biased umpiring. The Mutuals protested the umpire, Rockford player Tom Foley, again, no relation to the Foley of the White Stockings. They said that the umpire was intimidated by the howls of the hometown crowd and refused to call strikes on Chicago batters, thus awarding Chicago batters easy walks. Remember, at this time, calling balls and strikes was optional rather than mandatory. Ronnie Walters, pictured there, the Mutuals hurler, threw a dozen pitches to Chicago's Bug McAtee, none of which McAtee swung at, and none of which were called strikes. At which point, Walters declared that he could stand it no longer and refused to pitch any longer. His teammates backed him up and soon walked off the field. Because of this walk-off, the umpire decided to revert the score to the end of the last completed inning, and they declared Chicago a 7-5 winner. Even this ruling created controversy, since baseball rules specifically said if a team walks off before the game is over, it should be treated as a forfeit by the New York club, a 9-0 loss. While in the first 8 innings, the umpire had awarded several walks to Chicago batters versus none to New York batters, it seems that any complained about the umpiring until the 9th inning. The New York newspapers and those of other cities backed the Mutuals' claim and called the partisan umpiring, quote, disgraceful. The Chicago newspapers, who presumably watched the same game, replied that the New York Mutuals pitcher deliberately threw wide in order to tire out the Chicago batters, and that New York walked off the field because they knew the White Stockings were going to come back and win. Needless to say, the Mutuals objected to the umpire's decision and challenged the White Stockings to another game on neutral ground. Chicago agreed to play them in Cincinnati the next week, but it seems that the Mutuals backed out of the agreement. Now, the next day, the Mutuals traveled to Cincinnati, and they lost to the Red Stockings in a no doubt about it game, 23-7, which further weakened their claims to be the national champions. Next slide. Well, here's some reactions to the Mutuals' claim. That game. One Cincinnati newspaper claimed that the Mutuals were euchred by the umpire, and euchred was a term at the time for basically being a card cheat. The New York Herald said, quote, that the Mutuals were cheated out of a game at Chicago. Nobody in this section doubts. Henceforth, no decent club will go to Chicago, and the amalgamated 9 of the last mentioned place may claim the championship if they will. No respectable organization will recognize them. Now, since the SABR and the SABR group is quite often in statistics, the box score of the game has Chicago accepting 10 walks to New York's none, which seems to back up the charges of umpire bias. Next slide. Now, this is the overall record of the teams here. The Mutuals claimed the championship based on having the most wins against professional teams. Of course, they're ignoring the fact they also had the most losses. The Mutuals also made the preposterous claim that the games against Chicago and Cincinnati that they lost were mere exhibition games, and thus should not count toward the championship. Chicago claimed the championship based on the traditional rule of deciding which team was champion, wins in head-to-head contests. They had, after all, defeated the Mutuals twice when they were champions, and Cincinnati twice. The Cincinnati Red Stockings also laid claim to the championship on account of the fact they lost fewer games than either club, ignoring the fact that they lost to Chicago twice. The Philadelphia Athletics even claimed the championship, saying the Mutuals only got the championship by beating Brooklyn, and we beat Brooklyn earlier than that, so we should have been the champions going into the fall, not the Mutuals at all. In the 1860s, the champion team and the championship flag, and yes, there was a pennant, described as 43 feet long. Well, the championship was a term by a system even the New York Clipper labeled absurd. The champion club thus retained its flag until another club beat them twice. This resulted in all sorts of shenanigans, such as the champion clubs avoiding playing any other team that looked like it could beat them twice. According to this tradition, the Brooklyn Atlantics, the so-called champs entering the season, of course, they were only the champs because they refused to play the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1869. They lost their title, according to this, on June 20th, when they lost the second time to Philadelphia Athletics. But again, the Brooklyn Athletics claimed that this second loss was a quote-unquote exhibition game. On September 15th, the Mutuals in New York beat Philadelphia for the second time in a row, thus claiming the flag. And they had beaten Brooklyn twice, too. Now, Chicago defeated the Mutuals on September 27th in New York in an undisputed game. And when Chicago claimed the November 1st game, they had every right to claim the championship. However, the Mutuals, still griping about the biased umpiring, refused to give the championship pennant up. And the war of words between the four teams continued into the next year. Now, historians differ on who was the championship at the end of 1870. Historian Marshall Wright labeled the situation, quote, murky, but opined that Chicago had won a, quote, tainted pennant. 30 years later, Albert Spalding, a Chicagoan, asserted that Chicago had won it. Historian Bill Rysick suggested when Cincinnati beat the Mutuals 2 days after the Chicago game, the Reds having beaten the Mutuals twice while the Mutuals were still champion, the Reds had a claim. Again, he's sort of discounting the November 1st game in Chicago. Perhaps a New York Times reporter had the last word, quote, it would take a Philadelphia lawyer to find out who was the champion club of 1870. Now, the muddled question of baseball's championship was among the first issues addressed when the professional teams gathered in New York to form their own organization in March of 1871. There, the plan was adopted to award the championship at the end of the season to the team having won the most games among the contenders. That would entitle the winning club to fly the championship pennant for the entire following season. Regardless of who was champion for that year, the Chicago Tribune called on the White Stockings officials to disband the club. The Tribune believed that the team had accomplished what it set out to do, which was defeat the mighty Red Stockings as well as all of the comers, and was now at the top as champions of the baseball world. The paper wanted the club to avoid a demise like the Red Stockings had suffered in 1870. The Red Stockings, by the way, folded after the 1870 season because they hadn't made any money. Like the Red Stockings, the White Stockings also lost money, about $3,000 that year. But as the Chicago Tribune reported, quote, the stockholders have lost neither faith nor enthusiasm. And it need surprise no one if, after the 1st of January, they announce a name that will challenge comparison with any in the land. Next slide. Now this is, no, one too many. Now this is just a timeline of the so-called championships to try and explain it. Again, the New York ball clubs have done what they quite often do, which is do anything to keep the championship within New York or Brooklyn. Notoriously, they tried to exclude the Philadelphia Athletics from playing championship games for years. Now they were doing it to Cincinnati. Now they were doing it to Chicago. After the June 20th game, in which the Brooklyn Athletics, the so-called champions, lost to the Philadelphia Athletics for the second time, but the Athletics claimed that game was an exhibition, so it really shouldn't count for the championship. The Spirit of the Times, a top sporting journal, brushed off Brooklyn's claims to still be champions as, quote, a flimsy title which the Athletics claimed, but of which no one cares a snap for, save themselves. After the Mutuals defeated the Athletics, the New York Times dismissed Mutuals as, quote, our so-called champion nine. So you can see the baseball championship was not determined by some statistical thing, but rather by whether your hometown newspaper backed you or not. Next slide. Well, what happened next year, 1871? Well, first of all, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players was formed. At the Fred Conference, there was a big debate over whether they were the first major league or not. 3/4 of the audience thought that they were the first major league, by the way. And this will last from 1871 to 1875, and they'll be replaced by the National League in 1876. In 1871, the White Stockings again competed for the pennant. And they were competing for first until October 8th, 1871. And what happened that day? Of course, that's the day of the Great Chicago Fire, as you can see. If you look real closely, you can see we see the river coming through, and just a little bit to the left of there, that's the White Stockings Stadium. That was about where Millennium Park in Chicago now is, and it's going to be burned. The team stadium, the team records, the team treasury, the team uniforms, the team equipment, all that was burned in the fire. And to finish out the season, the last 2 weeks, the Chicago team had to play with borrowed equipment and borrowed uniforms. And they had to play all their games on the road. And as you might imagine, the club didn't do too well. They lost the pennant to Philadelphia A's, who had poached Ned Cuthbert and Levi Meyerly from the White Stockings to Philadelphia. They claimed to be the champions. The club is disbanded after the 1871 season. For 2 years, as Chicago has to devote its energies and money to rebuilding the city, which was destroyed by the fire. And pro baseball will not return to Chicago until 1874. Next slide. Well, the rest of the story is the team rejoins the National Association in 1874. The National League is formed with a big input from Chicago in 1876 to replace the National Association. And in the next dozen years, the Chicago White Stockings win 6 pennants in those 12 years. This is the greatest run in Chicago baseball history. 11 top 3 finishes, 5 pennants. They featured the pitching and management of Hall of Famer Albert Spalding, who was not only a Hall of Fame pitcher, but the founder of Spalding Sporting Goods Club, and the all-around slugging of first baseman Adrian Cap Anson, a Hall of Famer, baseball's first slugger, and he still owns the Chicago Cubs record for most hits and highest batting average. The team that spent most of the 1890s and early 1900s way out of contention. Next slide. Now, I was asked at the Fred Conference how the White Stockings became the Cubs. Well, here's their nickname timeline. Cap Anson left them about 1890, so he was the father figure on the team, so the newspapers started calling him the Orphans. Then they got really bad, so they were called the remnants of a good team, or the Remnants. They were bought by an Irishman named Murphy, and so they were called the Spuds. About 1899, the team was so small, physically small, that the newspapers called them the Microbes. Then they started to get some young talent. The newspapers called them the Colts. Oh, a colt, a young horse, is not too vicious, so they started to call them the Cubby Bears. And finally, they became the Chicago Cubs. Now, I'd like to leave you with this thought tonight. The legacy of the Chicago White Stockings lives on in Chicago and not just with the Chicago Cubs, their direct descendant. Because in 1900, when the American League was formed and the new American League placed a franchise in Chicago, the new team borrowed as much of the old White Stockings name, which wasn't being used by the team anymore. They borrowed the name and tried to latch on to the White Stockings traditions as much as they legally could. They couldn't call themselves the White Stockings, so they decided to call themselves the Chicago White Sox. And that's the American League team that we have today. Next slide. No, these are not two players on the team, no. But I would like to thank you for having me tonight, and hopefully there'll be some time for some questions. So again, thank you for having me.
There is always time for questions. I notice that Abe Lincoln here looks really good in these uniforms. That's pretty good. All right. If you have a question for our presenter, Bruce Allardice, tonight, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button. Once you do that, you'll hit another button called raise hand. Raise your hand and we will get you in line to ask questions of our presenter tonight. Bruce, that's probably one of the most detailed presentations I've ever seen and experienced. That's fantastic. How long did that research take you?
Well, I mean, off and on a while. I'm writing a book on the Chicago White Stockings, so it's I got 10 other. I'm a Civil War historian too, so I got like 10,
Oh gosh.
10 irons and a Scottish historian, so I got like 10 other irons in the fire. So, but it took me about 3 weeks, off and on.
Oh wow. Huh. Irons in the fire. That sounds a heck of a lot like my life between SABR and interior decorating, and I'm everywhere. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but all right, Roger Kathman, you're up. Save me, man. How you doing?
Very good presentation. I really enjoyed it. Um, you always blame the umpires no matter what. And it reminded me so much of college football for how many years where there was no predictable winner, you know. So great presentation, really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. One of the things I should add about the umpiring was, especially the New York Clipper, Henry Chadwick said, "Oh yeah, the umpiring might have been biased, but the New York Mutuals agreed to this guy Foley as the umpire, and once both teams agreed to him as the umpire, they were bound to go by his decisions, no matter how much they thought they were biased or not." So Chadwick takes the interesting line that even if the umpiring was biased, the New York Mutuals still should have not objected to the decision by the umpire because they had agreed to him. Remember, in those days, there was no professional umpiring staff. The teams would agree on an umpire. And the Cincinnati game earlier that Joanne talked about with Milligan in her poem, basically the teams couldn't agree on an umpire. Then this guy came out of the stands and said, "Hey, I've umpired games out east, so why don't you make me the umpire?" And both teams agreed to him. And it turned out he was incompetent, but not biased. But thank you for the question. Good question.
Things were a little bit different in the early days of professional baseball, weren't they? Don't you agreed to this? So if it's biased and it's going against you, tough noogies. You don't get to argue whether you like it or not.
Well,
Go ahead.
that was the point of that whole Fred conference debate over whether the National Association was a major league. And the objection was not that it wasn't major. The objection was it wasn't an organized league because they don't have the kind of professional umpiring and set schedule that a modern league has. Now, whether that was the definition of a league in 1871 or not is more the question. But Bob Folks, who you probably know, says, it was major. It was the best players. It just wasn't a league. And this is
just a group of guys that got together and played ball.
Yeah. And the whole championship imbroglio shows that it wasn't an organized league.
Very interesting. Anything else tonight for Bruce Allardice? It was such a thorough presentation. You've explained everything perfectly. We appreciate that, Bruce.
Well, there's several chat things. I don't know. Are there any questions?
Lots in the chat. One of the things that I put down earlier is when you were talking about the writing from those times. I love discussing the writing of Major League Baseball or of any baseball from that time, if only to find new superlatives to use in everyday conversation. So people say, "Wow, where did that word come from?" And there's just so many terrific words to describe people in a negative light that really don't sound negative. Yes, perfect. All right. Next Monday, May 12th, we are going to have a very special guest with us. SABR director Tara Krieger will be here to give us a reprise of her recent presentation entitled, Did Lou Gehrig Have a Lost Pitching Career? I've seen this one. It's good. You're going to like it. The link to sign up is in the SABR events calendar and our chapter meeting schedule booklet distributed with each Monday message newsletter. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you're not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world, just like Bruce Allardice. He's got one, that's for sure. For more information, go to sabr.org today. Bruce Allardice, you are fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce, for having me.
I appreciate you doing this. Thank you very much. We're going to get everybody out of here. We will see everyone next week. Thanks a lot. Have a good night, everyone.